Hello friends, welcome back to another video on this channel. Today, we're diving into the life of Anne Shirley, the iconic protagonist of the Anne of Green Gables series and book saga. So, without further ado, let's get started. Anne Shirley was born in the fictional town of Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia, the daughter of teachers Walter and Bertha Shirley. No specific date of birth is given, but references in later works suggest that her date of birth is 5 of March 1866. Anne was orphaned as a 3-month-old baby when her parents died of typhoid fever. With no other relatives, the child was taken in by the Shirleys' housekeeper, Mrs. Thomas. Years later, however, her husband died, and Anne was forced to live with the troubled Hammond family. For some years, Anne was treated by them as little more than a servant until Mr. Hammond died, after which Mrs. Hammond divided her children among her relatives, and Anne was sent to the Hopetown orphanage. Mrs. Hammond had 3 sets of twins, whom Anne helped to raise, and for whom she came to be regarded as cursed. At the age of 11, Anne was moved from the Hopetown orphanage to the neighboring province of Prince Edward Island, which she considered her real home. Unfortunately, she arrived by mistake. Her godparents, siblings Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert, wanted to adopt a boy to help them on their farm. But the neighbor they had messaged was sure they had asked for a girl and sent Anne instead. Matthew was quickly fascinated by the girl's kind spirit, charming enthusiasm, and vivid imagination, and from the first moment he wanted her to stay in Green Gables. Marilla reacted by sending her back to the orphanage, but was eventually convinced by Anne's peculiar joie de vivre and the fact that another woman, much tougher than she was willing to keep her if Marilla refused to have her. The American scholar Joseph Brennan noted that for Anne, all things are alive, as she imagines trees by the roadside welcoming her to Green Gables, while a leaning plum tree makes her think it is offering her a veil just for her. Anne had a great imagination, fueled by books of poetry and romance, and a passion for romantic and beautiful names and places. She had been starved of love in the orphanages she had lived in, and for her, Green Gables was the only home she had ever known. Anne initially made a bad impression on the people of Avonlea when she had an outburst against the Cuthberts' neighbor, the gossipy Mrs. Rachel Lynde, which was made good by an apology. Despite this, Anne soon becomes bosom friends with a girl from a neighboring farm, Diana Barry. Along with Matthew, Diana is Anne's soulmate. However, their friendship was cut short by the temporary enmity of Diana's mother, after Anne mistakenly got her friend drunk on Marilla's homemade gooseberry wine, mistaking it for raspberry cordial. Anne soon regained Mrs. Barry's sympathy by saving the life of Minnie May, her youngest daughter. Minnie May suffered a bout of flu, which Anne was able to cure with a bottle of Ipecac and the knowledge gained from caring for the many Hammond twins. Throughout her childhood, Anne continued to find herself in similar predicaments, often through mistakes and misunderstandings, and through no fault of her own. At one point, Anne admires to madness an amethyst brooch, which she is falsely accused of stealing, a crime she has to confess to in order to attend a picnic. Anne tended to defend herself against older people through humor and forged a relationship with Marilla Cuthbert, with whom she shared the same kind of humor. She even asked her to call her Cordelia and Geraldine, as she liked to imagine herself as someone she was not. Anne also develops a complex relationship with Gilbert Blythe, who is 2 years older than her but studies at the same level as her, as his studies were interrupted when his father became ill. On their first meeting as classmates, Gilbert teased Anne with the nickname Carrot, or Carrots. Anne, perceiving this as a personal insult because of her hair color sensitivity, became so angry that she smashed the blackboard over his head. When her teacher punished her by making her stand up in front of the class and later made her sit with the boys, specifically Gilbert, Anne began to hate it. Despite his attitude, Gilbert repeatedly showed admiration for Anne, but she coldly rejected him. Her resentment persisted even after he saved her from a near-disastrous performance of Tennyson's Lancelot and Elaine when his leaky boat sank in the pond. After this near-fatal accident, Gilbert begged Anne to befriend him, but she hesitated and refused, though she soon came to regret it. For the rest of their school years at Avonlea, they competed as intellectual rivals to be top of the class, although the competition was entirely good-natured on Gilbert's part. However, at 13, Anne formed the Story Club, in which she told the story of two girls named Cordelia and Geraldine, both were aliases she had previously adopted, who love Bertram, a variant of Gilbert. The story ends with Cordelia pushing Geraldine into a river to drown with Bertram, suggesting that subconsciously Anne is attracted to Gilbert. Finally, Anne and Gilbert walked together to Green Gables, where Gilbert jokingly told her, "You've already thwarted fate for too long." In the end, Anne found herself looking out of the window, admiring Avonlea as an ideal dream world, through which she sees a bend in the road thanks to Gilbert. After graduating from Avonlea Public School, Anne and Gilbert entered Queen's Academy in Charlottetown, where they were prepared for teaching and university studies. They shared the most prestigious awards and remained enemies throughout their studies at Queen's. Anne's grades, especially in English, earned her a scholarship to Redmond College, but Matthew's death and Marilla's deteriorating eyesight caused Anne to postpone her enrollment at Redmond so she could stay and help out in Green Gables. Gilbert had been appointed teacher at Avonlea for the following term, but, as an act of kindness, he accepted the post at White Sands School and gave the Avonlea post to Anne. She thanked him for the sacrifice, and they reconciled, finally becoming friends after 5 years of intense rivalry. Later, Marilla decided to take in her cousin's twin children, Davy and Dora, continuing Anne's curse of the twins. However, Anne took an immediate liking to them, especially Davy, and learned to handle the twins through a mixture of good humor and understanding. As well as teaching, Anne joined the Village Improvement Society, which worked to demolish the ugly derelict houses, repaint the village, and plant a garden at the crossroads, although the mean neighbor, Mr. Harrison, attacked Anne as a spiky, red-headed girl who sits around reading yellow-covered novels. When a famous writer, Mrs. Morgan, visited Avonlea, Anne was greeted with a red nose due to her mistakes in applying the wrong skin lotion, as she had overexerted herself to surprise the famous author, but instead caused chaos, although it all turned out well in the end. The encounter with Mrs. Morgan inspired Anne to try her hand at writing, and on one occasion, while trapped in an abandoned chicken coop, she penned a dialogue between the flowers and the birds in the garden. Another altercation occurred at her school, where Anne forced a pupil to throw a package into the school cooker, unaware that the offending package was firecrackers. The following year, Rachel Lynde's husband Thomas dies, and Rachel moves with Marilla to Green Gables, leaving Anne free to continue her education at Redmond College in Kingsport, Nova Scotia, which pleased Anne as Gilbert would also be going to Redmond the following year. After the wedding of her friend Miss Lavender, Anne realized for the first time that there was a possibility that Gilbert felt something more than friendship for her, and the page of girlhood had been turned, as if by an invisible finger, and the page of womanhood lay before her with all its charm and mystery, its pain and its joy. In a new phase of her life, Anne's academic and social life flourishes in Redmond. Once there, she visited the house where she was born in Bolingbroke and reflected deeply on how her mother died young, but at least she knew the joys of love. During her time in Redmond, Anne wrote 2 stories, one of which was rejected, but turned into a successful story by Diana, and another which was dismissed as lacking a plot. Diana edited Anne's story, Averil's Atonement, and turned it into a successful story that sold well, but Anne felt that the final published version was a parody that distorted her artistic vision. In search of poetic inspiration, Anne spent her time alone on Victoria Island, where she withdrew into her own world of fantasies, amidst a landscape curtained with a thin penumbra spun in the moonlight, while the water lapped around her in a duet of stream and water. At the beginning of the novel, Anne and Gilbert, looking forward to spending 4 splendid years in Redmond, stroll through the haunted forest to taste the delicious apples, in which, beneath the tawny skin, was a white flesh, faintly streaked with red, and besides their own apple flavor, they had a certain wild and delicious flavor, which many interpreted as Anne's newfound desire for Gilbert. She also used to hang out at her favorite place, Patty's Place, where she and her 3 best friends spent evenings with a fireplace, 3 cats, 2 porcelain dogs, and a potted plant full of chrysanthemums that lit up through the golden gloom like creamy moons. Gilbert, who had always loved Anne, proposed to her, but she refused. At the time, Anne's view of love was deeply rooted in sentimental fantasies, and she did not recognize her closeness to Gilbert as love, and called Gilbert's marriage proposal grotesque and horrible, as she laughed that she would fall in love with her prince, who would fit her childhood ideal of tall, dark, and handsome. And Gilbert, feeling deeply disappointed, distanced himself from her. Later, Anne haughtily turned down Charlie Sloane's offer of marriage and later accepted the courtship of the dark and handsome Roy Gardner, whom she met one rainy November afternoon in her junior year of high school. After a year and a half of dating, he proposed to her in the park where they met. But Anne ended their relationship when she realized that she didn't really love him and that he didn't belong in her life. After graduating from Redmond University, Anne, now 22, returned to Avonlea to find that life had changed. Her childhood friend Jane had married a millionaire, and her best friend Diana Barry, now Diana Wright, had given birth to her firstborn child. And while Anne still didn't believe she was in love with Gilbert, she was disappointed by the end of their friendship and confused by her reaction to the gossip that he is in love with Christine Stewart, a fellow student at Redmond. On her return to Avonlea, after staying with her friends Paul, Stephen, and Lavender Irving at Echo Lodge, Anne learns that Gilbert is deathly ill with typhoid fever. So she decides to look after him and spend the night in his room when Gilbert's fever breaks, at which point she realizes that she has always loved him, only to lose him. Once Gilbert had recovered from his illness, he proposed again, and she finally accepted. Gilbert offered her an autumn fantasy, a house with a fireplace, a cat and a dog, the footsteps of friends, and you. He then explained that Christine had been engaged to someone else all along, and that Gilbert was just being friendly, as Christine's brother had asked him to look out for her. Anne's friend Phil Blake had written to Gilbert telling him to try again, after which he quickly recovered and took his advice. Their engagement lasted 3 years. Anne's engagement ring was a pearl ring instead of a diamond, a stone she said always disappointed her because it was not the beautiful purple she had dreamed of. Anne took a job as a principal in Summerside, Prince Edward Island's second-largest city, while Gilbert completed his 3 years of medical school. During this time, Anne became involved with various eccentrics both at work and around town and rose through the ranks to become headmistress of Summerside School. As both principal and teacher, Anne had to deal with the difficult vice principal Catherine Brooke, who went out of her way to be rude to her. Brooke openly envied Anne's ability to be happy and tried to bring her down at every opportunity. However, Anne was a more mature version of herself, having overcome the obstacles of her youth and motivated by a desire to help others, and noticing that Brooke's poor upbringing was due to her own low self-esteem, she helped her find a job that suited her better. Anne and Gilbert eventually married in Green Gables, the house where Anne grew up, and moved to the town of Four Winds. There they settled in a cottage Anne called the Dream House, and Gilbert took over his uncle's medical practice in nearby Glen St. Clair. Anne praised her dream house as a creamy seashell stranded on the harbor shore, which is surrounded by fir trees, enveloping secrets, while the road leading to the house is lined with flowering trees. The house overlooked a harbor on one side and a shimmering stream in the valley below. Anne's biggest problem at the dream house was helping her neighbor Leslie Moore, whose husband was left brain damaged after an accident and who is as emotionally damaged as her husband is. Anne's first 2 children, one of whom dies in infancy, are born in the dream house, before Anne and Gilbert and their growing family reluctantly move to larger accommodation. In a moment of theological reflection, Anne wonders whether her son's death is God's will. After Anne's loss, she and Leslie grow closer as the 2 women share their stories of grief. Anne and Gilbert lived the rest of their lives in Glen St. Mary, in a large house they call Ingleside. They had a total of 7 children between about 1895 to 1900. Joyce, who dies shortly after birth in the dream house, James Matthew, Walter Cuthbert, the twins Anne and Diana, Shirley, the youngest child, and Bertha Marilla. Anne became seriously ill after the births of Joyce and Shirley, but recovered on both occasions. A major problem for Anne arose when Gilbert's odious Aunt Mary Maria visited and refused to leave, tormenting Anne in various ways. Anne's children enjoyed a happy, even idyllic childhood, spending much of their time playing and adventuring in a nearby hollow they called Rainbow Valley. Anne was a permissive mother who was never hard on her children, although they were often bullied by unpleasant children, so her mother had to console them a lot. At one point, Anne tried to resume her writing career, publishing a very poetic obituary of a neighbor that is described as an obituary by a publisher. Anne herself lived a comfortable life, with a maid named Susan Baker, who effectively ran the household and was also Shirley's main carer after Anne fell ill in childbirth. Once recovered, Anne served on several ladies' committees in the city and traveled to Europe with Gilbert for a long tour of the European continent, at one point around 1906. But the specter of the First World War in 1914 changed things, and the three Blythe boys, as well as Nan and Rila's fiancés, ended up volunteering to fight in the war. The sensitive and poetic Walter, the second of Anne's sons to volunteer, died at Courcelette in 1916. Jem was listed as missing at the end of the war, but after 5 harrowing months, he made it out alive after escaping from a prisoner of war camp. Anne's last appearance was in the collection The Blythes Are Quoted. In this work, somewhat darker in tone than Anne's earlier books, we see brief glimpses of Anne in a series of short stories dealing mainly with other inhabitants of Glen St. Mary and taking place from the pre-World War I era to the beginning of World War II. The book also contains a number of poems attributed separately to Anne and her son Walter, plus one begun by Walter and completed by Anne after his death. In the early days of World War II, we last see an older and wiser Anne, in her 70s. Mrs. Dr. Blythe, as she is often called, is a well-known and talked-about figure in Glen St. Mary, beloved by some, though other residents express jealousy or petty envy of both Anne and her family. Although Anne has mellowed from the days of her youth, she and Gilbert continue to tease each other with mischief and good humor. She continues to enjoy her love of matchmaking and also writes poetry. She is still married to Gilbert and is now the grandmother of at least 5 grandchildren, 3 of whom are old enough to enlist to fight in the war: Jem Jr. and Walter, Jem's sons, and Gilbert Rila's son. There is also mention of Nan's daughter Dee and a granddaughter named Anne Blythe, who could be either Jem's or Shirley's daughter. Although Anne stops writing short stories shortly after becoming a mother, she continues to write poems throughout her life. She regularly shares these poems with the rest of her family, who offer her comments, criticism, and encouragement. Anne's last poems express her profound difficulties in coming to terms with Walter's death and the idea of war. Several characters comment that neither Anne nor Gilbert were ever the same after Walter's death. Still, the couple devote themselves entirely to each other and their family, and when the saga concludes, around 1940, the Blythes remain pillars of their community who have enjoyed 50 years of marriage. What other character from the Anne with and Dee saga would you like us to talk about on the channel? Let me know in the comments.